In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate a jogless method of working garter stitch in the round. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. When you work garter stitch in the round, you alternate a round of knits with a round of purls. And when you do that, you get this seam line at the transition from end of round to beginning of round. And the reason for that is that when you're knitting in the round, you're actually knitting a spiral. So this little swatch was also knit in the round with garter stitch, but this swatch does not have a seam line anywhere. And the reason is because it uses a technique called helical knitting that takes advantage of the spiral nature of knitting in the round. You don't need to start with a slip knot. You have the two tails and the needle in your right hand. Hold both of them. That will put some tension on those yarn tails, and then you get yourself up in the boomerang position to do the long tail cast on. And then you cast on however many stitches you need. When you work the long tail cast on, this thumb yarn is what is creating the edge. And this is the yarn that we're going to use to create purl stitches. The yarn that was tensioned around the index finger was used to create the loops that are on the needle. And we're going to use that yarn to work our knit stitches. So we have these two separate strands that we're going to continue to use. So I'm going to place a marker for the beginning of the round just so that we can remember where that is. So I want to use, again, that thumb yarn. You can see it coming out of the edge here. This is what I'm going to start with. And I'm going to purl the first round. I'm going to stop 3 stitches before the end of the round. Okay, I have 4 stitches. I need to do 1 more purl stitch, and then I'm going to stop. I'm not going to complete the entire round. I'm stopping 3 stitches early. I'm going to leave that yarn, the purl yarn, in the front. The yarn that I'm going to be using to knit is right here. It says 3 stitches away. I haven't returned to the point where that yarn is, so I'm going to slip these 3 stitches, and then I'm going to slip my beginning of round marker as well. So now I'm going to knit all the way around until I'm 3 stitches short of where the yarn for the purl stitches is. So I have 2 more knit stitches to go. I'm going to leave the knitting yarn in the back, and then I'm going to slip these 3 stitches so that I can get to where the purl yarn is hanging, and then I can continue again purling. And again, I'm going to stop 3 stitches before the location of the yarn that's for the knit stitches. So this process continues round after round, and you're always stopping 3 stitches before. So why are we doing this? It's not actually a requirement that you stop 3 stitches before. You could stop 10 stitches before. You could stop 1 stitch before. You could even stop at the stitch where the other yarn is hanging. You just can't work past it. But typically, the advice is to stop a few stitches before, because if you stop at the stitch, so if I actually work up to and including the stitch where the knitting yarn is hanging, if I do that, you see how loose that yarn is? It's now off the needle, and you can't really control the tension except by how much you're pulling on it. The needle isn't there to prevent you from over tightening as you work with it. So I could have just stopped at that same stitch, then I could pick up the knitting yarn and continue from there if I wanted. But I don't have a lot of, I have to really try to control my knitting tension on that stitch that's underneath the needle where this pearl yarn is now hanging. So if you always stop a few stitches short, then you know that you're controlling your tension really well for the complete round. Now, at some point, you're going to decide that you have worked long enough. Either you want to bind off or you want to transition to another stitch pattern. Maybe you had only been working a garter stitch border and you want to work the rest of it in stockinette stitch. When you're ready to do that, and you have switched to now you're ready to do a knit, it doesn't matter where the pearl yarn is really in the round, but once you're working your knits, you're not going to come all the way back around to 3 stitches before the pearl yarn. Instead, you're going to stop at the beginning of the round. So you're going to, wherever the knitting started in this round, you are going to continue until you get to the beginning of the round. So here I am, I'm at the end of the round. I'm going to move the marker and I'm going to work that first stitch of the round as a knit. And now I'm going to put the yarn down. And now I'm going to work purl stitches, and I'm going to work purl stitches until I get to the end of the round. But first I have to get to where the purl yarn is. So this time, instead of slipping 3 stitches until I get to the purl yarn, I've stopped quite a bit sooner than that. So I'll just slip stitches until I get to where that purl yarn is. So now I'm at the purl yarn, and now I'm going to work until the end of the round. So now I'm at the end of the round, and this is where I want to stop working my purl stitches. So at this point, I'll leave the yarn in front and I'll cut and leave myself a yarn tail. And then if I'm going to be continuing working longer, like maybe I'm switching to stockinette, I could leave this marker here if I needed it, but if I don't need it, I can just take it off at this point. So now I can switch to either working stockinette or doing my bind off. And just like other times when I stopped working purl stitches and then I had to slip stitches until I got to the knit, the stitch with the knit yarn, I'm going to have to slip this stitch because that one has already been worked. And now I can begin my bind off. So the first stitch of the round has been knit. Here's the second one, and I bind that off, and then I can just continue working this as a regular bind off round. Now when you work this last stitch, because this yarn is attached, it's going to seem a little sloppy at first. It's going to pull loose, but you can just pull out any slack out of that. Pull off the last stitch, cut the yarn tail, and then like any bind off, pull on this last loop until the tail pops out. So you want to come under the first bind off chain. This is going to look like part of the bind off chain. It's not, it's the stitch, the last stitch. So you want to come through where you see these 2 legs together. And then you come back down through the center of the last bind off chain. And you adjust the tension so that that bind off chain matches the others. Then you thread the yarn from the purl spiral and you find that knit stitch that's right below the bind off chain, and you go down through the center of it. And that just kind of merges these 2 purl ridges together. And then you can just weave in those ends on the back. So at the cast on end, you're going to thread both of those yarn tails onto the yarn needle at the same time. And then you're going to take both of those and you're going to, you can see where this jog is. You want to kind of fill that gap in by inserting your yarn needle down in between these 2 diagonal strands of the cast on. Put it through there, pull it through, and then snug it up as needed to match that edge as best you can, and then you can weave in those two tails at the same time. But having both of those tails through the same place really helps to fill in that little gap. You still may have a little bit of a jog there, but it does help fill that in. This video topic came from a question asked in my Ravelry group. If you have a suggestion for a video, or if you have any comments or questions about today's video, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.